Summer, 1943 Texas sky. The sun beat down mercilessly on the fields outside the barbed wire. Dust swirled with every step as a line of Japanese prisoners of war carried clumsy sacks and farm tools. Their plain dark fatigues clung to their backs, boots heavy in the dirt, heads freshly shaved by camp barbers. Many worked in silence. Others moved slow under the weight of heat and defeat. Suddenly, the stillness broke. The deep roar of piston engines thundered across the prairie sky. Heads turned upward instantly. The sound was familiar aircraft. For these men, memories of war still lingered in that sound. Japanese Zeros screaming over Pacific islands, the menace of American bombers hammering beaches, the terror of engines circling in the night. But what streaked across the sky above them was different. The planes that appeared were sleek training aircraft AT-6 Texans, with gleaming aluminum wings that glinted in midday sun. They circled gracefully, diving and banking, engines growling as propellers carved the air. Prisoners squinted into the glare, murmuring in disbelief. They expected the pilots to be young American cadets, boys preparing for the next front. Instead, the camp's watchtowers echoed with astonishment. The silhouettes inside the cockpits were not men. They were women. Hands gripped hose and sacks tighter. Prisoners nudged one another. The unmistakable figure of women pilots, their hair tucked beneath leather helmets, goggles strapped over determined eyes, filled the glass canopies. At first, disbelief. Then whispers, incredulous. Women! Women! Flying? To the Japanese captives, the sight was impossible. Back in their homeland, women were expected only to serve households, to support from shadows, to bear sons for the empire, never to fight, never to command engines of war. The militarist code had drilled into them that war belonged to men alone. And yet, here, across an ocean, their enemy entrusted women to soar above camps, ferry warplanes, and train like professionals in the art of flying. Even the guards smirked, watching the stunned faces of the captives. A young American GI leaned on his rifle and chuckled, "Even our women fly better than you fight." The prisoners stiffened, silent. The humiliation stung more than heat, more than fatigue. The roar of a woman-driven engine carved sharp lines across their pride. For soldiers who had once faced death rather than dishonor, this moment mocked every lesson they had been taught. The sky itself had turned against their worldview. The planes banked, dipped low, then rose elegantly again, fading into the southern horizon. But the silence that followed was heavier than the roar that came before. Prisoners stood frozen, still staring at the empty sky. The realization pressed deep. This nation was not weak, not divided, not decadent. If America trusted even its women with machines of war, what other truths had their leaders concealed? In the dusty fields of Texas, the engine hum of women pilots became more devastating than any bomb. And for the stunned men below, staring upwards in disbelief, it was the first crack in a worldview that had seemed unshakable. The astonishment in the fields was more than a spectacle. It was the result of two unusual currents of history colliding: Japan's captured warriors and America's women in uniform, both placed in the same unlikely corner of Texas. By 1943, the United States faced a problem and an opportunity. A problem? Tens of thousands of prisoners of war captured in the Pacific campaigns had to be housed, guarded, and given work far from the front lines. An opportunity. America's farms, factories, and training bases were short on hands as millions of young men were overseas. The solution was radical. More than 400,000 Axis prisoners, Germans, Italians, and Japanese, were transported across oceans, scattered in over 500 camps across 46 states. Texas became one of the busiest hubs: Camp Hearn, Camp Kennedy, and many others dotted small towns, often right beside U.S. Army airfields. Here, every day, prisoners in work fatigues trudged out of gates to pick crops, repair fences, or build roads. And just miles away, another radical experiment was unfolding. In 1942, America had created the WASP program, Women Air Force Service Pilots. Nearly 1,100 women were recruited, trained to the same demanding standards as their male cadets. They flew advanced trainers like the AT-6 Texan, ferrying aircraft from factories to airfields, towing targets for gunnery practice, even testing repaired bombers. While Japanese soldiers believed women should be confined to home roles, Americans placed women in cockpits, engines roaring, on missions vital to the war effort. That meant that in towns like Sweetwater, Texas, where Avenger Field became the beating heart of WASP training, the skies were filled daily with the sound of women at the controls. Their flight paths often crossed directly over farmland where POWs worked, or over the very camps where prisoners idled behind barbed wire. Imagine the contrast. Below, captured Japanese soldiers in plain PW uniforms, boots dragging through dirt, bent under sacks of cotton or chopping weeds. Above, women in leather flight jackets and goggles, their propellers carving perfect arcs across the sky. It wasn't staged propaganda. It was casual practicality. For Americans, women ferrying planes was as routine as any work detail. For Japanese captives, it was an earthquake to their worldview. Some POWs muttered nervously that it must be a joke, a trick. Others stood paralyzed in their rows, eyes locked upwards until guards ordered them to move again. The sight did not match the image of America painted back home, a nation portrayed as weak, lazy, morally corrupt. Now, the weakness they expected flew engines faster, straighter, and louder than anything they could have imagined. Few moments in captivity could pierce as deeply as this. It wasn't hunger or boredom that shook them most. It was the casual roar of a warplane, controlled not by the men they had expected, but by women they had never believed would stand in a cockpit. The first flyovers might have felt like an accident, a strange coincidence. For the Japanese prisoners bent over rows of cotton or lined up for morning roll call, perhaps they thought, one strange day, then it passes. But it did not pass. Day after day, the pattern repeated. American skies filled with planes' ferry flights, training runs, engine tests, and again the pilots inside were women. Slim silhouettes with scarves tucked at their collars, goggles strapped across foreheads, hands steady on the controls. For the Japanese captives, it was no passing anomaly. It was routine, and that routine gnawed at their very sense of order. The fields became small theaters of humiliation. Prisoners dropped their heads into their sacks, pretending not to notice as a B-25 bomber rolled overhead with a woman at the controls. Guards, smirking, sometimes teased them deliberately. "She flies higher than you ever will." POWs clenched their jaws in silence. The roar of engines was both familiar and utterly foreign. These men had once cheered the terrifying charge of Zero fighters in the Pacific. They had seen comrades die diving into enemy fleets. But here the same roar, the same scent of oil and fuel now defied every expectation. Not only had they been captured, but now they were reminded daily of America's strength in ways too casual, too ordinary, to reconcile. Some stared until guards barked them back to work. Others whispered to each other that this must mean America had so many pilots they didn't even need all their men. Imagine the humiliation. Men expected to die for their emperor, now laborers under guard, watching women practice maneuvers in advanced trainers just above their heads. The rhythms of camp life were filled with moments like this. Prisoners trudging to irrigation ditches or sharpening farm tools looked up as P-51s, ferried by WASPs, thundered past. On rest breaks, sitting cross-legged in the dust, They squinted against the sky while twin-engine planes pulled away toward distant bases. For many, the sting grew sharper each time. It wasn't merely about gender roles, it was about power. They had been told relentlessly that America was fragmented, weak, a land of greed and chaos. And yet, here was a society that trusted everyone to contribute. Men fought in Europe and the Pacific. Women drove tractors, worked factories, and took cockpits. Black and white soldiers served side by side. Mexicans, farmers, women, mechanics, pilots, all forming a vast network of labor and skill. For Japanese prisoners who had lived under a rigid system of hierarchy, every glimpse of this diversity working together raised questions. Every woman banking a Mustang above their heads was another crack in the image of a corrupt, fragile democracy. Locals saw their astonishment with amusement. Children near the camp fences were known to cheer and point whenever a woman pilot roared overhead. To them, it was pride. To the prisoners of war, it was torment. One guard later recalled, "We could see it on their faces. They would just stop and stare when a WASP flew over. Some would mutter, shake their heads, even laugh nervously. It rattled them. More than any punishment we gave, that rattled them." And the women in the cockpits? Many had no idea of the power they carried just by flying above prisoner compounds. They were not performing for captives. They were doing their job ferrying warplanes to bases, testing engine repairs, towing targets for cadets. But beneath their wings, men sat broken, stunned, their propaganda dissolving with every passing flight. For the Japanese prisoners, captivity was meant to be chains, hunger, labor. Yet nothing bruised their pride more than these moments in the sky. Each engine became a reminder that in this strange nation, even the weak could master the air. And every day, as women pilots soared above watchtowers and cotton fields, silence spread among the prisoners. Silence that was not peace, but disbelief. The silence of shock among the prisoners echoed louder because, for Americans, there was nothing strange about women pilots. Around the Texas training fields, local communities welcomed the WASPs. Many townspeople treated them as daughters, sisters, and heroes. They were invited to parades, and their photos graced small-town newspapers, alongside headlines that praised their contribution to the war effort. At Avenger Field near Sweetwater, the training base became a source of local pride. Townsfolk turned out to watch the women take off, laughing with confidence as they darted across the skies. Prisoners noticed. From within the fences, Japanese POWs saw civilians applauding when squadrons of women ferried planes over the countryside. They watched as towns cheered openly, as American families spoke proudly of "our girls in the sky." For men who believed flight was the ultimate symbol of power and masculinity, these scenes were disorienting beyond words. To the guards walking the compounds, the prisoners' disbelief provided subtle amusement. One GI later recalled watching their faces. They would just stop in the middle of whatever task they were doing, hammering posts, cutting weeds, and they'd tilt their chins up, stunned. We didn't even have to say anything. The planes spoke louder than we ever could. Cultural contrasts struck again and again. Prisoners noticed school children who ran along fences, waving toward the sky as WASPs soared above, cheering them with the same joy reserved for husbands, brothers, or sons in uniform. In Japan, the sight of women handling aircraft at all would have been inconceivable. Here, even children accepted it as simple reality. Some POW memoirs written years later describe the shock almost with awe. A common word used by survivors when recalling those sightings was unthinkable. Their disbelief wasn't only because the women flew, it was because everyone else, from guards to farmers to children, expected them to fly and admired them for it. The camps themselves echoed with whispers. At night, behind barbed wire, POWs spoke quietly in their bunks, murmuring disbelief about the women pilots. Some thought it was temporary. Surely the Americans would stop such a risky idea once the war turned. But days passed, weeks passed, and the flights continued. And every day they couldn't look away. The humiliation grew sharper when guards teased, "Even our women fly our planes. What about yours?" The POWs, bound by silence, could only stare back at the ground. Yet, to American families and communities, there was nothing to mock. Women pilots were a badge of national confidence. They were proof that America could draw on all its strength, every man, every woman, every resource. The contrast ran deeper than the POWs could process. While their homeland clung tightly to hierarchy and rigid gender roles, here was a society that accepted flexibility, encouraged opportunity, and trusted women with machines that carried life and death in their wings. For many of the captured men, the contradiction began to gnaw at them more painfully than long hours in the fields or bland rations in the mess hall. Ideology was one thing, reality was another. They could endure fences, heat, and hard labor. But reconciling what they saw in America's sky with what they had been told in Japan was impossible. It was a clash of worlds. On the ground, in dust and silence, broken soldiers bent under sacks. Above, in leather jackets and helmets, America's women roared past in engines of war, cheered, celebrated, respected. For men once taught that women must never set foot in a cockpit, perhaps no sight in captivity wounded more deeply, nor planted the seed of doubt more firmly. When the war ended and ships carried surviving Japanese captives back across the Pacific, most returned to a homeland they barely recognized. Cities lay as ruins, families faced hunger, and the once mighty empire had collapsed overnight. But among the memories these men carried home, some were so unexpected that even their countrymen refused to believe them. They spoke of food in abundance, of American guards who laughed, of libraries and canteens inside prison camps. They spoke of fairness, of wages, of strange freedoms that would have been unimaginable in Japan. But one memory drew disbelief more than any other: the memory of women pilots. In conversations, memoirs, and testimonies recorded decades later, former POWs often mentioned it with the same astonishment as they had shown the first day they looked to the sky in Texas. Over and over, they insisted that the single most incomprehensible sight was not the guards, not the fences, not even the food. It was women commanding the air above them. Some described the humiliation with bitterness, others with quiet awe. One recalled, "It was then I understood that America had strength we did not know. Even their women were trusted with warplanes. We could not imagine such a thing. It destroyed what our leaders had taught us." For many, these moments cracked the armor of propaganda more effectively than any Allied pamphlet or speech ever could. They had been raised in a system that confined women to homes, schools, and supporting roles. To see enemy women not only working in the fields and factories, but soaring in the cockpits of B-25s and AT-6 trainers was disorienting beyond explanation. It planted questions that lingered. If their own leaders had lied about America, what else had they lied about? If women were capable of flying warplanes, what else might Japanese society have suppressed? Historians later noted that captivity in America transformed thousands of POWs not by violence, but through exposure to everyday contradictions. And perhaps no contradiction was more striking than this: women commanding machines of war while enemy men bent beneath barbed wire fences. To American communities, there was no grand message in it. The WASPs did their jobs day after day, ferrying planes, training cadets, and keeping the machinery of war turning. Local families cheered, newspapers praised, and children waved at the silhouettes in the sky. They never knew that across fences, Japanese prisoners stared upward in disbelief, their silence louder than the roar of engines. But for those captives, it was unforgettable. When freed and repatriated in 1945, they brought the memory back to Japan, a nation where women could not yet vote and were still bound by limits of tradition. To many, the story sounded like fantasy, but to those who saw it with their own eyes, it was not myth. It was the moment the illusion cracked when warplanes overhead carried not men, but women, revealing truths that no propaganda could disguise. And so, in one of history's strangest collisions behind fences in the sweltering Texas sun, humbled soldiers looked to the sky and found not bombs, not destruction, but the faces of pilots they had never imagined possible. For them, the shock was deeper than defeat. It was the sight of a democracy so confident in itself that even its daughters could take the sky. And in that revelation, silent but undeniable, their worldviews broke apart. What they saw above them was not weakness, but strength. And it is that strength they would never forget.